All right. While the other presentations are generally going to be more important, I suppose you can consider this one the fun, little interesting quirk of trying to connect two ideas. Just a little curious question of mine. Who here listens to metal? Okay, that's about what I expected. So this is going to be a very... I gave myself hard mode, basically. All right. The evil song you sing inside your brain, the anti-philosophical growth of Nietzsche's new philosophers. Friedrich Nietzsche's descent into madness, while likely the mundanity of an unknown illness, can be poetically interpreted into something more. Poetry seems an appropriate starting point to loop back towards, and the proper vehicle in which we can understand the severity of a particular portion of Nietzsche's thought. In particular, comparing Nietzsche to Laocoon, I'm very bad with Greek names, allows for a Grecian sense of tragedy. Nietzsche himself was aware of just how much his ideas rocked the boat, likening himself to dynamite upon Western thought. He had spent the majority of his career stabbing, impaling, and lambasting the various schools of thought that existed in his time. Kant, Schopenhauer, Catholic tradition, and so forth were not spared his wrath. He deigned to strike any that he saw as contributing towards destruction. He thrust his spear into the guts of every philosopher or religion gifting Europe with the Trojan horse whose belly held nihilism. Where'd it go? By striking against the gods of philosophy and Christianity in such a violent manner, he provoked them to react. They cast him aside, ridiculing him until he was a broken, lonely man. Few deemed him serious enough to respond to, let alone engage with. In that solitude, his mind was broken, and the serpent of madness took him to the sea. Or, to put it in line with the popular metaphor, Nietzsche stared into the abyss, battled monsters, was stared back at, and tumbled down as a monster himself. The particular noteworthy aspect of Laocoon as a reflection of Nietzsche is the timeliness and scale of what each was warning his fellow man about. Laocoon was warning the Trojans of Grecian hospitality, rightfully skeptical of the intention of the gift given by the Greeks. Nietzsche, far removed in time and reality from Laocoon, was attempting to warn us, modern humanity, of a Trojan horse in the guise of philosophical thought. What separates these two is the apparent legitimacy of their warnings. Hindsight allows us to appreciate the tragic irony of Laocoon, but we do not have the same luxury when it comes to Nietzsche. The poison of the former was to be felt over the course of a single destructive and bloody night of conquest. The poison of the latter is a gradual and almost imperceptible descent. Nietzsche, for all his bombast and hyperbole, attempted to warn us of a subtle creeping nihilism that could not be detected so easily. What makes the poison so insidious was its very ability to be perceived as anything but poison itself. We, even a century removed from him, would see ourselves as acting properly within a constructed epistemological and moral understanding. Within these frameworks, we would convince ourselves that outliers and unnerving trends would simply be misinterpretation and fear-mongering. The system cannot be wrong, and all anomalies wouldn't disprove the rule, but likely enforce our faith in it. I do not see myself as a Nietzschean man, so I don't subscribe to many of the prescriptions that Nietzsche had laid down for future philosophers. Yet what I have read of Nietzsche has left a deep-rooted doubt. His writings, his philosophy, his warnings have opened a Pandora's box within me, bringing forward a loud inner skepticism towards our direction as a whole. I believe a serious study and measurement of Nietzsche's predictions is important. Since Nietzsche likened the presence of this nihilism as an illness to the soul, then a similar metaphor seems appropriate. If the illness is difficult to detect by its symptoms, then we will likely find the presence of the illness by the production of antibodies towards that illness. In this case, to detect the nihilism that Nietzsche warned us of, we ought to search for the new philosophers that Nietzsche saw as the antidote. Our first step is establishing the traits of these new philosophers. While several portions may appear to be universally understood, the adoption of Nietzsche's philosophy among various groups, such as fascists and anarchists, have created wildly different accounts of what Nietzsche expected from future philosophers. These varied and even combative interpretations of Nietzsche's new philosophers creates a barrier that is difficult, I'd say impossible, for a paper of this magnitude to address. For that, I will simply point towards Walter Kaufmann as the definitive interpreter towards understanding how the first half of the 20th century was a poor time for interpretation of Nietzsche. Those who claim Nietzsche as their own after Kaufmann are various and slightly connected under the title of continental philosophy. Each appropriated various aspects, extracting that which suited their own ideas, and discarded the portions that didn't suit their needs. Understanding the intricacies of how these interpretations morphed over the years is a task also beyond this paper. For that, I will point towards Rudiger Safransky's Nietzsche, a philosophical biography. Instead, I will establish what I believe are important philosophical underpinnings. Sorry, I'm guessing with these slides. I can't see the next preview. Instead, I will establish what I believe are important philosophical underpinnings of what Nietzsche's new philosophers would be. To begin with, these new philosophers would hold a deep and violent skepticism towards the moral philosophies that exist in their day. Quote, "The philosopher has at length a right to bad character. As the being who has hitherto been most befooled on earth, he is now under obligation to distrustfulness, to the wickedest squinting out of every abyss of suspicion." This skepticism, when fully brought forth, would lead to a reevaluation towards individuals as the cornerstone and heart of future philosophy. Quote, "In putting the vivisector's knife to the breast of the very virtues of their age, they have betrayed their own secret. It has been for the sake of a new greatness of man, a new untrodden path to his aggrandizement." The main target for this vivisection would ultimately be the Christian morality, and all those who mimic or bolster it, because of its direct opposition to these new philosophers. Quote, "We should not deck out and embellish Christianity. It has waged a war to the death against this higher type of man. It has put all the deepest instincts of this type under its ban. It has developed its concept of evil, of the evil one itself, out of these instincts, the strong man as the typical reprobate, the outcast among men." These aspects, even with all the previous appropriations mentioned earlier, are generally understood to be Nietzsche's expectations. I wish to focus on one particular aspect of Nietzsche's new philosophers that requires more focus for future publications. Nietzsche did not believe that these new philosophers would be philosophers. That is to say, they would not view themselves as professional philosophers, nor as part of the formal field of philosophy. Quote, "Presupposing always, to begin with, that the term philosopher be not confined to the philosopher who writes books, or even introduces his philosophy into books. Hitherto, all those extraordinary furtherers of humanity whom one calls philosophers, who rarely regard themselves as lovers of wisdom, but rather as disagreeable fools and dangerous interrogators, have found their mission, their hard, involuntary, imperative mission, in the end, however, the greatness of their mission, in being the bad conscience of their age. Understanding this, I argue that current philosophers would find much benefit in peering outwards toward the common, or with respect and admiration, the vulgar man. Assuming that the new philosophers would be those who do not see themselves as lovers of wisdom, that they would vivisect the virtues of their age and would exist as the bad conscience of their age, we can assume these new philosophers to be objectively opposed to engaging with professional philosophy itself. Indeed, we may even find them to act, as Nietzsche put it, unphilosophically. Quote, "But the genuine philosopher does it not seem so to us, my friends, lives unphilosophically and unwisely, above all imprudently, and feels the obligation and burden of 100 attempts and temptations of life. He risks himself constantly. He plays this bad game." With this, we may understand Nietzsche's new philosophers as, in one sense of the word, anti-philosophical. In particular, Boris Groy's definition of anti-philosophy as a sister to Dada or anti-art is an appropriate definition towards understanding Nietzsche's new philosophers. In essence, the existence of Nietzsche's new philosophers are an inversion of philosophical engagement. Rather than seek the regular discourse and writing of philosophy, they will express their master morality through aphilosophical means. The rejection of philosophical traditions would exist beyond rejecting schools of philosophy and would culminate in a rejection of the systems of philosophy itself. Few of these new philosophers would find merit in academically engaging with philosophy, and few would find writing their philosophy for formal, to them likely detached, audiences as a worthwhile endeavor. Yet these are not the only avenues open for one's expression of their philosophy. In fact, we may find a hint towards these new philosophers in the very field that Nietzsche praised more than any other, art. Specifically, music artists seem particularly appropriate as an initial probe into the idea. After all, Nietzsche stated that by means of music, the very passions enjoy themselves. The more abstract the truth you wish to teach, the more you must allure the senses to it. There's a sense of irony as well in discovering the anti-philosophy of Nietzsche's new philosophers within art, given Boris Groy's definition using anti-art. With this understanding, I argue that an examination of Nietzschean values within contemporary music would be best served by focusing on metal artists. The reason for this is due to various factors. For one, there is Robert Walser's, sorry, I keep forgetting he's American, not German. Can't do that. Okay. There's Robert Walser's examination of metal and metal audiences with Running with the Devil, Power, Gender, and Madness in Heavy Metal Music. An expansion on his original doctoral thesis, Walser was one of the first major writers to bring metal into a critical light that attempted to examine just what metal audiences got out of this genre. While there are others, I believe that Walser managed to capture one particular aspect that is relevant to both Nietzsche and metal: power and one's relationship to it. Quote, "The power chord can be percussive and rhythmic or indefinitely sustained. It is used both to articulate and to suspend time. It is a complex sound made up of resultant tones and overtones, constantly renewed and energized by feedback. It is at once the musical basis of heavy metal and an apt metaphor for it. For musical articulation of power is the most single important factor in the experience of heavy metal." For a second reason, metal has many influences to draw back on, but one in particular is Richard Wagner. While the two had a falling out over the years, Wagner is still supported as one of the composers that demonstrates Nietzsche's ideals of tragedy and art as an expression of philosophy. There are several metal artists that express Wagner as an influence on their works, including Rammstein for their album Mutter. Joey DeMaio, bass player of Manowar and Dr. Music, is a known Wagner aficionado. Even Christopher Lee, the well-known actor and metal artist, stated that, quote, "Now that I have been able to listen to many metal albums, I realize that the genre is a direct evolution of the world and the sounds that Wagner imagined." There is a lack of formal examination in linking of Wagner to contemporary metal, but this point is also examined by Walser. Quote, "When I began writing about heavy metal in 1986, it seemed a strange thing for a cultural critic, let alone a musicologist, to do. Metal has been ignored or reviled, not only by academics of all stripes, but even by most rock critics." So examining Nietzschean elements of metal sounds straightforward, but it is a task that will undoubtedly prove incredibly difficult. While metal as a genre, upon first examination, appears monolithic and rarely diverse, there is much fertile, complicated ground to cover. To demonstrate the diversity of this genre, we can broadly categorize metal into four quadrants: classic metal, mainstream metal, progressive metal, and extreme metal. Classic metal, demonstrated by such artists as Dio, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Megadeth, etc., are original progenitors of metal, built off of the influence of rock and roll, punk, and proto-metal beforehand. Mainstream metal, which takes plenty of influence from classic metal, combined metal with pop sensibilities to create a genre that manages that fine line of self-proclamation with mass appeal. This contains such bands as Disturbed, Avenged Sevenfold, Metallica, Pantera, Slipknot, etc. Progressive metal exists as the experimental branch of metal, with a variety of artists creating fusion subgenres with various other genres. This would include bands such as Nightwish, Camelot, Diablo Swing Orchestra, Dream Theater, Therion, etc. Extreme metal takes most of the elements of metal and turns the dial up to 11, focusing on violent imagery, heavy symbolism, and dark or harsh music. This category would fit such bands as Behemoth, Bathory, Satyricon, Cannibal Corpse, Slayer, etc. Kind of comes through in the names, really. Each of these quadrants have wildly different sounds and feels to the music they produce, and critical examination of how to categorize metal as a whole is a hotly contested field for music. However, there are various Nietzschean elements that seem to transcend these musical boundaries and are worth examining for philosophers. Specifically, metal as a whole exhibits four traits that strongly overlap with Nietzsche: strong individualism, anti-Christianity, tragedy, and the sublimation of evil. Each of these elements are likely to be found within metal artists in one capacity or another, but it's not as simple as stating that each holds all in equal measure. Each artist tends to focus on one or two of these Nietzschean aspects, with the other portions serving more as footnotes. Nightwish, for example, is a band heavily focused on tragedy, mostly through the ruminations of poetry and the poet's relationship to his own work, and the sublimation of evil, mostly as an inspiration for that poet's work. Behemoth, on the other hand, is mostly focused on strong individualism and anti-Christianity, shown through heavy and violent symbolism of Satan as a central figure of the work. Further study would allow us to better extract how these elements interplay within contemporary metal and why different subgenres of metal focus on particular aspects. As it stands, the focus of extracting Nietzsche from artists such as Wagner and Strauss, the most popular points of study, is only one portion of the wide, wild world of music. Alliteration is worth examining. Studying Nietzschean thought in contemporary music, especially in metal, allows us a broader view on this portion of society. For one, it allows us a conduit to understanding the evolution of Nietzschean thought within the evolving field of music. For another, it will likely give us insight into the organic growth of Nietzschean thought outside of formal and professional philosophy. Such an insight might help us adapt to a rapidly changing world of philosophical expression and even warn us of those changes that may not be so favorable. Now, I have gotten permission for this. For those of you who don't enjoy metal, the next 8 minutes is going to be uncomfortable. But I could sit here and tell you till the heat death of the universe that there is a connection, but I believe it is better to demonstrate a connection. So I have taken 3 quotes from Thus Spoke Zarathustra and put them next to portions of metal songs themselves. It is all clean.
Within Part 1, Section 7, Reading and Writing, Zarathustra says, quote, "He that writeth in blood and proverbs doth not want to be read, but learnt by heart. In the mountains the shortest way is from peak to peak, but for that route thou must have long legs. Proverbs should be peaks, and those spoken to should be big and tall. The atmosphere rare and pure, danger near, and the spirit full of a joyful wickedness. Thus are things well matched. I want to have goblins about me, for I am courageous. The courage which scareth away ghosts createth for itself goblins. It wanteth to laugh. I no longer feel in common with you. The very cloud which I see beneath me, the blackness and heaviness at which I laugh, that is your thundercloud. Ye look aloft when ye long for exaltation, and I look downward, because I am exalted. Who among you can at the same time laugh and be exalted? He who climbeth on the highest mountains laugheth at all tragic plays and tragic realities. Courageous, unconcerned, scornful, coercive, so wisdom wisheth us. She is a woman, and ever loveth only a warrior." End quote. This portion is reflected quite interestingly within Nightwish's story time, in which a poet is reflecting upon his deathbed the significance of his own work, and he comes to interesting conclusion. Within Part 1, Section 4, Zarathustra says, quote, "The creating self created for itself esteeming and despising. It created for itself joy and woe. The creating body created for itself spirit, as a hand to its will. Even in your folly and despising ye each serve yourself, ye despisers of the body. I tell you, your very self wanteth to die, and turneth away from life. No longer can yourself do that which it desireth most. Create beyond itself. That is what it desireth most. That is all its fervor. But it is now too late to do so. So yourself wisheth to succumb, ye despisers of the body. To succumb, so wisheth yourself, and therefore have ye become despisers of the body. For ye can no longer create beyond yourselves, and therefore are ye now angry with life and with the earth. And unconscious envy is in the sidelong look of your contempt. I go not your way, ye despisers of the body. Ye are no bridges for me to the Superman." End quote. While this is certainly an allusion to many sorts of philosophers that Nietzsche had a problem with, there is a clear connection between this and Christianity, which matches almost perfectly with Holy War by Iron Man. You choose to
follow evil. You think your life is so pure. I know you lost your mind, prisoner of illusion. In the name of God you're killing. You will be king in heaven. You preach the bad words to the children of this world. I just want to be free. I'll always be the master of my life and destiny. Your heart is so black, committing all these crimes. You stab a knife right in my back. Holy war, tell me what you're fighting for. Do you wanna fight eternally? Holy war, you won't find what you're raging for. The whole world is your enemy. You are the
In Part 1, Section 11, Zarathustra states, quote, "A state is called the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly lieth it also, and this lie creepeth from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. It is a lie. Creators were they who created peoples, and hung a faith and a love over them. Thus they served life. Destroyers are they who lay snares for many, and call it state. They hang a sword and 100 cravings over them. Where there is still a people, there the state is not understood, but hated as the evil eye, and as sin against laws and custom. This sign I give unto you, every people speaketh its language of good and evil. This its neighbor understandeth not. Its language hath it devised for itself in laws and customs. But the state lieth in all languages of good and evil, and whatever it saith, it lieth, and whatever it hath stolen." End quote. While the previous two seem to be a direct parallel with the general idea of what Nietzsche was stating, this example, that is, divide by disturbed, almost seems like a direct continuation of the idea and a response that, I believe, interpreting it within a sort of Nietzschean individualist position is not that difficult to see.
go. I wanna tear a big hole in what is to be. Doing all this infatuation with unity. I'm seeking my salvation alone again. I never needed to be one of you anyway. Don't wanna be another player losing in this game. I'm trying to impress upon you. We're not the same. My own individuality is so unique. I'm unimpressive, but now wouldn't you say? Divide, 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 divide. You might say that I'm the last man standing now, and though you try, you'll never find a way to break me. You might say that I'm sick of being lost in the crowd. I hear the sirens, but they're never gonna take me.
However, there is a further question, which is this purely metal that exists within the English-speaking world, or is this a wider phenomenon within metal itself? So, I'm going to use two songs here, one from Spain and one from Russia, that are applicable to the quotes that I have stated earlier, as well as the songs I've stated earlier. I will be showing the original lyrics while the song is playing, while also translated lyrics.
La muerte no nos podrá arrebatar, las quimeras dejadas atrás. Somos hijos de la tempestad, cuerpo y alma en un sueño inmortal. No es la mano de los dioses la que escribirá el final, ni el antojo del destino, ni los golpes del azar. Son los actos del presente los que nos otorgarán un lugar
believe I can retire from an academic field now. I just got a whole room of you to listen to part of my playlist. But that is everything. So, questions? Plaid shirt.
What do you think about, like, have you heard of the band Bloodywood?
No.
You should.
I will take personal recommendations afterwards.
The reason I ask is because I found out about them because they have a specific song that talks about, specifically in men fighting suicide. And, like, because there's been such a rise in, like, first world countries of, like, neurotic behaviors being selected for by culture.
Yeah.
And how that leads to certain problems with that.
Well,
I think it's interesting, like, the power boards and all that stuff, and how, like, that affects mental health.
yeah. Actually, there's a wider connection to existentialism as a whole in metal. And one of the guys, he was actually in an earlier slide, Albert Camus. One of his books was The Myth of Sisyphus. And the whole reason for that book was the problem of philosophical suicide itself. And you actually see that element pop up quite a bit in metal all over the place. The whole idea of, like, oh, is my life really that worth it? Yes, it is, because I am living it. And very interesting directions people have taken it.
So you talked about kind of the instrumental part and the lyrics and how they kind of support this. I'm wondering if you have any comments about in metal the interaction between the instrumentals and the lyrics, because that seems like a powerful part of it. Does that support yours?
I'm not that very well versed in the theory of music itself. The portions I do know, I generally have stolen from people who do know the theory of music very well. But you're asking specifically about the interaction of music and lyrics, as in, do I believe that the construction of the music itself is supposed to elevate the ideas of the lyrics? I believe that is generally the case. Many of them actually take inspiration from classical composers that attempted that idea in the first place. Specifically, Wagner, again, is a good example of somebody who was trying to musically capture the very elements that he was talking about. Tristan und Isolde, brilliant opera, I would recommend it if you haven't seen it, is built around dissonance. The entire opening section is just an incredibly dissonant intro, upon which Wagner said the only way to play it correctly is incorrectly, because if I were to play it correctly, it would drive men to madness, which is very much in line with the sort of language we hear about metal itself, that it's that devil's music that will drive men towards evil and sin and all sorts of interesting things. Wagner, people like Wagner, Paganini, Vivaldi, three big inspirations for modern metal, actually were generally considered the same thing. But Paganini was touted across Europe as given the power of the devil's violin. So the language actually translates quite well from the 1800s to now. We good?